And yeah, so I would like to kind of give you a little bit overview, kind of a little bit of also time travel from the past 5, 6, 7 years when I started with my PhD and kind of develop these things and the capacity to build big, hopefully useful data sets. And yeah, with the title towards, oops, just a second, I just need to move over here. That bar towards a circumpolar permafrost disturbance monitoring with big data and machine learning, with this nice little aerial photo from Western Alaska with a lot of Great Lakes. So lakes will be kind of a big part of that talk. And I first of all thank all the people who they wouldn't fit here on the slide. So all the people that kind of I worked together over the past years. This work was kind of part of many different projects. It's kind of a lot of project juggling or somehow at the moment. So I'm involved in that. I'm working at AVI. I'm involved in PDG, Global Permafrost, Arctic Passion, Guido's Petacar project where I started. The currently started ML for Earth, which is from TU Munich, and yeah, PDG, of course. And with that, I would like to start. So just a very brief intro to permafrost and the things that we're looking at. So most of you, I guess, are somehow pretty much attached to permafrost, know what it is, know most of the processes. So in permafrost, yeah, landscape dynamics can be pretty fast, but we can just make kind of a distinction between kind of slow processes like gradual thaw, which can be quite well, let's say, modeled and predicted. So that goes into these kind of big scale climate models and predictions. But we also have like pretty quick processes, right? So in our case, we're focusing here on thermokarst lakes, which can be pretty dynamic, but also thaw slumps and erosion processes. So they all have in common that they're quite dynamic. So they change the appearance of the landscape. They have quite a strong influence on biogeochemical cycles. There are a lot of feedback loops, and these are not really well quantified yet. And there are, I mean, locally, regionally, there are data sets. Is quite a good understanding, but really on a kind of panarctic scale that's well, and maybe not good enough yet. So they all have in common permafrost region, pretty remote. So there are a lot of these features, so they're abundant. So they can have quite a strong influence just by their sheer amount and size. And here in this kind of talk, we're gonna focus on lakes and thaw slumps. Here's a nice little example of a, let's say, small lake on the North Slope in Alaska, which already shows one of the main processes. So thermokarst lakes, or lakes in mostly sedimentary permafrost, is typically expanding. So once there's kind of disturbance, then pond is forming, lake is forming, kind of, which is kind of formalized by the thermokarst lake cycle. And this is kind of an example that already shows, okay, lakes are expanding. There can be block failures that can be a bit slower, gradual slow, but typically we expect lakes to grow slowly until something like that happens. Of course, they cannot grow indefinitely. They don't grow hundreds of meters per year, so it's typically a few centimeters or maybe a meter per year. But then eventually many of them drain for various reasons. Bank overflow, they're cut by rivers, etc. But this is kind of, these processes both have kind of consequence on biogeochemical cycles. For example, if they grow, we typically assume that there's kind of carbon release due to methane release and erosion of the formerly frozen material. And once we have lake drainage, we assume that these lakes can work as a carbon sink because new vegetation growing, peat degradation, etc. So this is why it's kind of important to map them and to understand the processes. Okay, let's travel back a little bit in time. So I kind of, when I started in permafrost in 2014, I kind of came into Guido's group. Before I didn't work in permafrost, but kind of my topic of PhD was kind of understanding, mapping, monitoring these kind of changes, and kind of stuck to that more or less. So because it's pretty exciting, and I started kind of using Landsat. So by the time they were accessible, they are a great data source, pretty long term. Many sites in the Arctic and across the globe. We have them since the 70s, so now we have like 50 years of Landsat. But in the Arctic, it's a bit trickier. So I was more focusing on the period since 2000, because since then they are kind of available across the entire Arctic. And so what I did to kind of understand the lake dynamics was kind of having a data stack over time. So downloaded all kind of Landsat data that I have in a certain region back then, and kind of small regions first. So we just have to start somewhere, right? So calculated multispectral indices, which kind of represent surface properties like water, vegetation, the brightness or albedo, and many others. So we then calculate some kind of temporal changes, just linear trends of surface changes. So in this specific case of tesselled cap indices, which are kind of the brightness, greenness, and wetness, which I took from Rob Fraser, who's also here. So he was kind of the inspiration for that and his work. So I definitely have to credit him here. And then we calculated kind of these visual output in the maps. So we could definitely see here some processes over time. So this gives us the spectral or the dimension of the spatial and temporal changes, right? So here we see, for example, lake. This is here this area here was where I took this photo, where there was this kind of block falling into the lake. This is kind of a lake, so that expands. So we here see these blue margins means there is transition from land to water. So the surface is getting darker. It's the vegetation is getting removed, but it's getting wetter. So from land to water, we have these kind of transitions, and that gives us a typical signature that we can also try to quantify or to map automatically. And we also have vice versa. So we have some areas where we have, due to this lake kind of merging together with this one, then the lake level dropped. So we have kind of these margins that where the water got removed. And we kind of could map that. And in my 27 paper, I also thought, okay, well, we can quantify that. So we applied kind of machine learning classification based on a random forest. We collected samples across the Arctic of 4 classes. So we have stable water, stable land, but also the change classes. So change from land to water, water to land. And we fed that into the machine learning classifier, had always an output. So here in this example, in dark gray, we see stable lake area or stable water. In light gray, we see stable land area. And in blue, we see the transition from land to water. So erosion, we can simply call it erosion. And the other way around here in red, we see the opposite. So we see a transition from water to land. So we have these classes, we know where something happens. But we don't only have kind of the class labels, so the real fixed ones, but we also have the probabilities. So we also have, we can say for each pixel, how much of the pixel has changed, because we have here 30-meter spatial resolution, and typically lake change is not always that quick, right? So that only parts of the pixels are covered. But then we have also for each transition or for each kind of these class also probabilities. So for example, if only half of the pixel got changed from land to water, we have we assume a probability of 50% for that it's stable land, but also 50% that there is a transition. So we also have this information. So based on that, we kind of create some kind of object analysis. So we first delineate each lake automatically based on these classes, and then we're also looking at these border areas to calculate the transition zones and to quantify them. And with that, we could create lake objects with certain properties, statistics, so change statistic from start to end, but also shape parameters. And based on these lakes, we could also do some spatial analysis, data aggregation, and that changes where they happening, how much is happening, to have that kind of more comparable and scaled. So we have on the one hand the object level, and we also have then the spatially aggregated raster data. And that's kind of where we started, but more in 4 small regions as kind of a test case. But that's where actually what most of these lake data are based on now. Okay, then 1 year later, we kind of thought, hey, we can do bigger. Their transects would be nice because there are surely changes from cold permafrost to non-permafrost. To assume, okay, there might be some influence of permafrost temperatures, etc., of the surroundings, of stratigraphy, etc. So we did kind of the same analysis for lakes, but also thaw sumps and fires. But here we want to focus on lakes, and that was kind of these 4 big transects, which you see here in orange, 2 in Siberia, 1 kind of covering Alaska and a little bit of Canada, and 1 in eastern Canada to have different stratigraphies, thermokarst versus non-thermokarst lakes, etc. So there we created kind of this lake data set. It was from 1999 to 2014 data. So we had lake polygons. We removed all non-lake objects, so river and sea, to focus on the lakes. Let's say, yeah, the filtering worked. Was also kind of a machine learning model. Worked more or less fine, not 100% perfect like every model. So maybe a few too much were removed from my experience or for my taste today. Yeah, but that's what we deal with. We did that for all lakes bigger than 1 hectare, and in total we had around 600,000 lakes. Most of them, or many of them, Eastern Canada, where there are a lot of lakes, but they're just completely different because they're mostly glacial origin. So dynamics are different, but you can see it in the data, which is pretty nice. We also have shape parameters like orientation, which is super cool for Northern Alaska, where we have a lot of oriented lakes. So you have kind of the direction in degrees. We have the perimeter, roundness. So especially with these oriented lakes, that's super cool to visualize. Sometimes it's, yeah, the question is if that's usable or if there's also, yeah, sometimes just fun, but you can choose yourself. So the data are there. And we also have change parameters. So there was change from 1999 to 2014. We're using here a kind of a linear trend, which is kind of, well, let's say, not very dynamic. So we only have kind of start to end, no years in between. That's something that might come later. But we have the start size, end size. But the good thing is data are comparable. So there are kind of, every location has more or less kind of the same data input. They're kind of pretty normalized. We got rid of a lot of noise. So there's kind of a trade-off between a dynamic data set, which is often also important, or more kind of a clean transferable data set, and we focus more on that. But there are also, in the meantime, a lot more data sets available that are more on the dynamic side. But with that linear trend, we are able to also look at subpixel accuracies, which helps because the spatial change is often very subtle, where we have to kind of look at these subpixel changes. And yeah, we had kind of for each individual lake, we have net change, but also kind of gross changes, because sometimes lakes have both. Like the example I showed, there's some expansion in some place, but then due to some other event, there's also, I don't know, vegetation growing in or whatever. And data set is available. It's all published. It's also in my 2018 paper. Everything's linked there. It's also, I would like to highlight this APGC website here, apgc.awi.de. There are also a lot of it's kind of all data catalog where we find a lot of permafrost related data sets, which is kind of curated by Avi. And there's also a QGIS plugin to access the data and download them automatically in from this APGC site. It's the CCAN plugin. Maybe I can send around the link or yeah, say more about that later if you like. Okay, so but that was kind of back then, right? So even in 2017, 18, I was looking at data from 1999 to 2014, and that had a reason. So I processed all of that stuff locally. So the biggest messy thing was querying for data, downloading data, different kind of Landsat pre-processing versions, did the trend calculation, machine learning model creation, lake change calculation. That was all kind of done on my workstation, which, well, not super great, but well, it's a few years ago, and things, yeah, were maybe done that way, or I didn't make a jump yet to kind of go to bigger and more efficient infrastructure. But for kind of, if we want to scale that to kind of the entire Arctic, we need to, yeah, apply better techniques, and we can do better, I think. So, especially for the first three parts, so querying for data, download, and trend calculation, is kind of a, well, it's, yeah, tricky work, which has to be avoided because it's pretty inefficient, it's pretty unflexible. Yeah, we thought, okay, we can definitely change that. For the latter part, which is still computationally intensive, but that's pretty streamlined, pretty efficiently implemented. We can still work on our premises because that's, yeah, nicely parallelized and not so easy to accomplish in Earth Engine, which we kind of, yeah, choose and for the pre-processing. So in Earth Engine, I guess most of you know Google Earth Engine. It's kind of, yeah, a cloud remote sensing cloud processing platform by Google, where you have all kind of the free data sets available. You can just query them, process them for free for non-commercial applications and research especially. So we transferred kind of our pre-processing pipeline to Earth Engine. So loading the data, calculating the trends, indices, and all that stuff that, especially on a kind of Pan-Arctic or global scale, actually I did some of the work globally, does work a lot faster there. So it's a lot easier. Then you have for further analysis, which we decided to do in our own premises, because it's a lot more, let's say, we have more control on the machine learning side locally. So we decided to do that locally. So transfer is still kind of an issue, and we're fighting a little bit with that to get the data automated out of Earth Engine. Then we run the same kind of analysis and models that we already used in the past. And within the PDG, we try to have kind of a continuous pipeline where we can trigger the process from start to end. We just choose kind of an AOI, and then everything's done in the background. So the pre-processing is triggered in Earth Engine. It automatically kind of takes care of the data management. So what's already ordered, what's there, pushes that to Google Cloud, downloads it locally, and then does kind of all the rest, like the lake analysis and visualization. We're almost there for having that fully operational. So far, some of that stuff I've done here at Avi. So for kind of this raw first or version 0, which is still kind of raw, which I will show, I've done mostly here at Avi. But for later future compatibility, we're definitely moving to the PDG work that NCSA has developed. So Todd is also here, Todd Nicholson, who did a lot of that stuff. And I don't know if Luigi's here. He's also involved in that.
Yeah, I'm here. I was going to say, since we're working on, Luigi isn't today, but yeah, since we're working on adapting to the pipeline and using Google Cloud on everything.
Yeah, that would be cool once it's done. Okay, now I show you some examples and results. Some of you, I try here, if I'm having different spatial regions, I try to kind of spread that out a little bit. across the world to kind of cater to all regional differences and maybe also to different audiences. So here I chose as an example because it's pretty dynamic. Maybe some of you might have already noticed, but what you see here already is there are a lot of lakes. So this is just the Esri satellite layer. And this is here in the east, you see the mouth of the Kolyma River. And this is quite a dynamic area. And this is just satellite image to get a feeling what it looks like, because we're all used to that. And then now I overlay that with the trend data, so that I explained to you before. So I processed the trend data as an intermediate layer. So we have trends of the Tesla cap indices, but also NDVI, NDMI, NDWI. For processing of the lakes, we also, for this machine learning model, we also use elevation data, so Arctic DM. All that goes into that. So there are a lot of layers, and a lot of information that are fed into the model. But here we see a nice example. There's also an Earth Engine app available for that. That's a positive time waster. It's great fun, and you can share it as much as you want. Most people really like it. And it's so great. You can discover a lot. You need to browse a little bit around to get a feeling, but once you know which signature means, it's kind of an eye opener to see. And you have that kind of globally available. So not only in the Arctic, but also in whatever, in almost all regions in the world. And here's a little example of this region, what it looks like. So here on the kind of macro scale, we already see here this blue one. So they recently had some flood events. So that kind of wetting signal comes in here very strongly. But we also see like here's a little fire scar. And we also see some yellow stuff here. These are drained lakes. And all the blue stuff means that there's significant wetting. But we can also zoom in, of course. So this is kind of a zoom in here where we see all the detail. Right here on the macro level, we don't see a lot of details, but once we zoom in here, there's a lot going on in the landscape. So we have, for example, here this draining lake. So there's a change from water to vegetation let's say for most of the area. So it's getting brighter, it's getting greener, and it's getting drier. So that's what the signal kind of gives you. If it's orange, there's no vegetation involved. So that's how you can also differentiate between draining lakes on sand, for example, where there's typically less vegetation involved afterwards and more organic rich material. But what we also see here is these lakes. So here we see these blue margins. We see, okay, there is quite a lot of lakeshore erosion. And we can, of course, quantify that. What we also see here, which is also nice, are these blue dots. I guess these are newly forming thermokarst ponds or lakes. So there are some disturbances going on there as well. So we can expect that these might grow into some lakes in the future. And to stay a little bit more on the macro level again, so this is what kind of the output looks like. So we see a lot of lakes. Here, this is just the visualization of the net changes. So what we do in the new data set. So in the latest version now, we also calculate normalized rates. So these translate to shoreline changes. So we have the area, we have the perimeter, and then we can calculate theoretically here in this case the shoreline change and shoreline position change. So we have growing lakes, maybe by a few centimeters, and we have shrinking lakes, and we can visualize that. And that's something what I also envision for the viewer, for the PDG viewer. And to come back to this specific example, so this is kind of the visualized trend data. There are in the data are a bit more, but this is how it's visualized. There we see the calculated lake polygon. So this is all extracted automatically. Fits quite well. So it nicely fits all the lakes. The boundaries are typically a little bit smaller, bigger than the lakes, because of the zone calculation. So the perimeters are typically slightly bigger than the lakes themselves. And we see here kind of the Landsat pixel kind of steps So maybe that's something that can also be improved. And then this is, you can query each lake once you have the data set of each lake. And you can kind of, let you output all these kind of information. So we have each lake has an ID. At the moment, we process them per UTM zone, which just gives you kind of a long stripe. The data sets come as geo packages. So these are, I'd say, the state-of-the-art vector format. So they are better than shapefiles. They're as fast. They only have one file, and they don't have this kind of stupid limitation of attribute names with just 10 digits. So you can add long names, for example, which makes things a lot easier. And in this case, for example, let's see, we have a change rate net meter per year is 1.6 meters. So we have a calculated shoreline erosion, mean shoreline erosion of 1.6 meter, which is for Thermokarst Lake quite big. But just getting back here, we see that, well, this is already quite a quickly eroding lake. So from my experience, so that looks quite good to me so far. Okay, this is kind of how you can also visualize it. I mean, there are many different ways. Here, maybe on kind of this zoom level, it might also make sense not to have the black background, but also maybe satellite image. But here we see these lakes are growing. That's picked up nicely. These are mostly stable here. And this is the drained lake, of course. If we zoom in, if we kind of calculate that, we would see that the area has decreased significantly. Elizabeth, you raised your hand. Oh, I can't hear you. I don't hear you.
Yeah, Elizabeth, you can write your questions, and then how about you write your question and then Ingmar can address it. Ah, yeah, right. You're having a problem. Florida.
Okay. Okay, I can't see anything yet. Okay. Okay. And let's see. Now I jump to North America to also cater North America, because also a lot of people are interested in that, I guess. So we also have the aggregated results. So we calculate the changes within fixed grid cells, like 3 kilometers at the moment and 7.5. These are pretty lightweight. They just, I don't know, a few kilobytes per UTM zone. These are really not big. It's just, just some pixels and raster files. And we can also visualize, but also kind of they have numbers behind that, right? So they're also quantified. And there we see nice patterns, which which are pretty interesting. We see some real data, I guess. Here in Alaska, I'm pretty certain that this is working. Here in Northwest Territories, there are some, let's say, there's some influence on the signal by fire, and fire scars. They have some influence. Well, I show you an example here, and then I comment on Elizabeth's question after that. So here we see a detail, an area I know pretty well, which is the coastal area of the Alaska North Slope. And there we see nicely kind of this coastal stretch. Some of that here is still kind of, because we still have some seawater in there. Here's some coastal erosion, but most of that is real lake change. So these lakes are expanding pretty quickly, because kind of the sediments are quite special. It's eroding pretty quickly. And here in the southern part, we have a tendency of slight decrease. They're pretty stable, so they're in sand. Some of them are shrinking slightly or plus minus neutral. So we see very, very gentle, let's say, drying signal. And another interesting case is Western Alaska, where I'm also quite often, where we see here, for example, the Selawik Delta. So this is super interesting, Selawik Delta region, which we see here kind of the delta front. We have expanding lakes, so it might be due to several reasons, like often getting flooded, maybe brackish water, so we might have an influence there. Also the same in the Kobuk Delta, where you also have kind of expanding lakes at the front, but kind of in the hinterland, we see, especially in the Selawik region, a lot of drained lakes. That was the example from the start screen. So there, it's really like crazy. And then Seward Peninsula is also the same. So there we have a lot of lake drainage, and also here in that area on the Seward Peninsula, we also see kind of the delta front region where we have more kind of expansion and wetting, and kind of in the hinterland we have more drying or draining conditions, which is pretty interesting, and but kind of matches with what we expect. Okay, I go back for Elizabeth's question. Okay, which one do you mean specifically? Like if we zoom in here, we see, for example, this blue stuff here, I would expect there to be more surface water, which kind of is a lot of that stuff, I guess, what you see in the MODIS data, Elizabeth. So we also have that on the North Slope, where we have kind of the opposite, where we see more kind of a drying trend of the surface. So that also has an influence. But here we're really looking at the lakes, but all the stuff in between, like here, I guess, there's a lot of drying. I expect from my experience that's formerly flooded troughs that are drying or draining. That's what we see in many places. And here it's kind of maybe ice wedge degradation, so that we see more wetness in the surface, and that fits often quite well, but that really depends sometimes a bit. And this yellow here is more kind of vegetation emergence in a formerly pretty wet, or in a pretty wet basin. So there are so many things. You can always kind of share links. So if you're in the app, you can just take the browser link and share it with other people. So you can always send me some locations if you're interested. Okay. Now a little summary of the lakes. So we're about to upload this data set and visualize kind of the same way, or very similar to what I showed you in the PDG viewer, which is a super cool tool. There are a lot of like data sets coming in. Also, Chandi's data set is coming in. I think it was there today when I checked. It wasn't visible, but will come in. Elizabeth Webb's data set is there, so it will become a very, very cool tool. It's already pretty easy to use. I really like it. And yeah, as a little summary of this lake work, so I will come to the thaw slumps in a minute. We have like individual lakes at the moment from 60 to 80 degrees north. I think for some areas we're gonna extend that, especially Eastern Canada, where Permafrost and like the also changing lakes especially are kind of further south. Then we have for that shape and change statistics. It's still a linear trend at the moment, so there are no individual years yet. We have aggregated raster statistics, and I counted the lakes, of course, not by hand, but we have, yeah, in this data set, about 5.5 million lake objects. So that's not as many as Chandi's polygons. Of course, Chandi's scale is always bigger, but yeah, still pretty cool. And the data should be comparable. What we have to do is validation comparison to very high resolution data. So if you have, I don't know, some good time series of digitized lake boundaries in whatever certain areas, maybe already even DSRS, so digital shoreline analysis tool analyzed somewhere, and would like to share it, I take them. So would be great to have. I guess for these big data sets, that's sometimes a bit tricky. Also with kind of spatial scaling and if that's really significant, etc. But these are details. Of course, what would be also nice is higher temporal resolution. So there are data sets that we could use. So there are a lot of new data sets coming out, be it like water-specific data sets like the JRC water change data set, which now also has more higher temporal resolution, or the Pickens data set, which are also all based on Landsat, but also higher resolution data. So there are land cover maps based on Sentinel-2 data and 10-meter resolution. There is this these AI-based land cover maps for each Sentinel-2 scene. So there are a lot of data sets that can go in there for kind of data cross-validation and improvement, especially on the temporal side. And these are kind of the things I think how this data set can be improved. Okay, any more questions about lakes?
Thank you so very much, Ingmar, for that presentation and for sharing.
I will come to the thought slums as well.
Oh, perfect. Oh, good.
so any questions for now for the lakes? Okay, up. First I comment on Elizabeth. So the question is, do you have a paper in the works for the Pan-Arctic lake data set? Not yet. It's not there yet. I have a kind of paper in the pipeline for analyzing my 2018 data versus a lot of other data sets. So what are the influencing factors of lake change? Then I have so much more stuff to do to publish. So actually, I have, I don't know, ideas for 5-6 papers, which I should be publishing in the next year, but I don't know. We'll see. Okay, now Chandi.
Oh, no, Ingmar. So it's really interesting. Now I'm starting to learn the system. Now you mentioned about the orientation of these lakes. We observe a similar thing with ice-edge polygons because we calculate orientations of individual polygons. In certain places, they have the same major axis orientation. What does that mean?
So a lot of polygons, I think, are in drained basins. So these basins also have the same orientation, especially like in Northern Alaska, right? So I guess kind of the basin morphology also has some influence on that because it's already kind of oriented. But then also, of course, maybe the same mechanisms that form the orientation of the lakes also influence the polygon formation. But maybe some others have a better idea why it's like that. I mean, Ben and Anna are quite a lot in the field. But that's, I guess, another topic. But the orientation is super cool. I mean, in Northern Alaska, it's so homogeneous. And even the ones where we have kind of an inverted, like they are typically minus 10 degrees, so 10 degrees to the northwest. And then we have the ones that are not that. They have kind of a 90 degrees, but that's typically lakes that are grown together. So the axis kind of then expands in that area. So originally they're also the same, also have the same orientation, but we don't have that in everywhere. It's really kind of depends on local conditions. But there are certain areas where we have a clustering and some it's not. So once you have a hand on the data set, there's a lot to play with, a lot to look at, and yeah, sometimes that takes a lot of time just looking at that stuff and thinking about it. But yeah, these are super cool. Okay, now I go to false lumps because I'm also interested. I'm interested in a lot of stuff, but also in false lumps, and yeah, they are kind of similar. So remote, they're not as abundant, so they're pretty clustered, but they're, I'd say, even more dynamic. But well, they have their issues, but I come to that. So here's some nice examples. The top left is the first false lump that I've seen in person. That was in 2014 on the Bykovsky Peninsula in northeastern Siberia, close to Lena Delta. Then on the bottom left, we have an example from the Baldwin Peninsula from last year, from our aerial campaign, where we see a nice little one along the coast. Then on the top right, I always use that, the Selawik slump, and then the same slump here on the bottom right as a nice 3D model. And they're pretty variable, so that makes it pretty tricky to to handle them, to map them, to analyze them. So that different size, of course, they have kind of a certain size range, different shapes, though scallop shapes, sometimes elongated here, nice scallop shapes, but they can be also kind of, well, along a coastline where you have a lot of like more linear feature. Stratigraphy for let's say observation mapping purposes can be tricky. Some are more in drier soils, some are in super organic, wet, dark soils. Vegetation can be variable. So if some are more in tundra regions, some are here in kind of tundra, taiga, ecotone. Some are in polar deserts, like in Ellesmere Island. So for mapping them and distinguishing them from the surroundings can be pretty tricky. They can have different dynamics, so polycyclic. And the definition is surprisingly, or at least for mapping, we don't really have good standards for that. So it's sometimes not even clear what is a false lump, which parts are interesting, which parts do we want to map, which not. So we also, as I said, maybe before, I think I said that before in the 2018 paper, we also did kind of analysis of false lumps, but automatically, well, that doesn't really work that well. It was kind of semi-automated manual selection involved in that. And 30-meter spatial resolution is, well, not really feasible for them in many cases. So if they're small, just a few pixels, how do you distinguish them from the surroundings, even if you have morphological information? But that's really tricky. So kind of finding that here in an aerial image is okay, but doing that across the entire Arctic is not so easy. So these are just some examples here from Taimyr Peninsula. So what we are looking at is erosion, dynamic features. They can be progressive or polycyclic. The size is from square meters to around square kilometer, but then it's pretty big. And in many places, I mean, they're undetected. They're, especially in Siberia, there are so many places where they are not at least known in the literature. You find a lot of cool places in this Trend app, which is super nice. So I discovered a lot of them in many places in Siberia where they were just not, at least not known to the public. And what is an advantage? That we can expect them to be kind of clustered. So they're bound to certain environmental conditions. So that's kind of something that we can use, or we can work with. And in the end, we have kind of a segmentation problem. So we want to either detect them if they are there, and also have kind of footprint, and ideally 3D kind of information where and how much they're changing. Okay, so coming back to this kind of what I said 2 slides before, with Landsat 30-meter spatial resolution is maybe well, not enough, right? And we need something better. So there are, over the past years, we had so much change in technology. So we have new data, remote sensing. Let's say industry is changing. I mean, we have a lot of new data that are globally available. So we have plant scope data, sub-daily, I'd say, if the weather permits, which is also a tricky thing in the Arctic. Because it's the optical data. We have these very high resolution constellations like from Maxar, if you have access to them, SkySat from Planet, Pleiad, and all these kind of super nice sensors, which are growing in quantity. So we have more data available. Also, of course, the M-Data Arctic DEM is kind of a game changer. Quality is sometimes a bit iffy, but as far as I know, there's going to be perhaps a new version or maybe even global model. We have new methods. First and foremost, deep learning. Some machine learning algorithms are also changing. Computer vision, image augmentation, all these technical advances, which are kind of, well, it feels like every new week there are some new models coming out there, some improvements. So there's a lot of movement in that field. And of course, computational resources. Which are crazy. I mean, with GPU processing, deep learning is required. Of course, it's expensive, but most HPC, so high performance computing systems, have some GPUs. Here we also have some good GPU systems. So I think in a pretty comfortable situation to use that. And of course, also cloud computing. As I said before, it's not only Earth Engine, it's also a lot more stuff like Planetary Computer. In Germany, we have some systems and all these things. So the whole landscape is changing, and keeping up with that is sometimes also a bit tricky, but that gives us kind of new opportunities. And so far, I mean, also the permafrost deep learning studies are kind of starting to come out. I think, we're always a little bit behind the curve, but there are some certain people and names which are kind of always popping up in that field, like Lingzhao Wang, who's doing great work. So he's working in especially that field, like mapping thaw slumps with deep learning. Of course, this person here on the left, who's also in the room, like Chandi and his group, are doing amazing work with mapping polygons, ice wedge polygons, but also thaw slumps on very high resolution data. It's so awesome. So the field is kind of evolving, and I think it's a super collaborative community. Also a new paper by Lingzhao, who's now kind of focusing more on Canada. So he's also involved with a lot of people here in that area, and we exchange very often and discuss things pretty open. So it's a really nice community that is focused on bringing that topic forward. So we already have kind of what we did is already, I'm working on that topic now, I think for 2-3 years with deep learning. So we already have a publication out there, which I will kind of go a bit into more detail now. So our target is to map thaw slumps with deep learning on planet data. So our main data source are planet surface reflectance data in 3-meter spatial resolution. So we have multispectral data in RGB and near infrared. We calculate the NDVI because in most cases thaw slumps are pretty different from the surrounding terrain, which then is vegetated, and thaw slumps typically have no vegetation or some islands of vegetation, maybe some remnants. Then the Landsat trends that I also showed before, which gives us already some temporal information. And also the Arctic DM. So we use a detrended elevation, so not have the absolute elevation, but more kind of in the vicinity. So if it's what kind of the position is within the immediate terrain. And we also calculate slopes because thaw slumps are slope processes. So we expect that to be important. And for this paper, now we have more data. We had around 2,200 polygons digitized by me and my student. But there we came to the question, okay, how do we delineate thaw slumps? What are thaw slumps? which parts are important, which parts are, do we just do the active parts, eroding parts, stabilized parts? I don't know. So that's why we came to the idea, okay, maybe that the community has to discuss that. So that's why how kind of was also one of the moments where we thought about, okay, there should be something better. Now there's this action group, IPA action group, where we discuss these things. And as an output, we have raster data. So the model, we train a model, and then the output gives us a raster if it's binary, so if it's Thorslump or no Thorslump, but also the probability. So here we again look at the probability values on the pixel level, and then we have a vector, actually polygon output, that we hope resembles a Thorslump. And this is kind of, these were the different sites. So we're looking at different sites here, some coastal site called Guyav Island in Russia. On the top, you see Banks Island with its crazy ice wedge polygons. Top right, it's Andalina River, which is more boreal site already. Bottom left, I think it's Tuktoyaktuk. Then we have Herschel Island, and this is close to the Horton Delta. So we try to incorporate different regions and create kind of a regional cross-validation to see if the model is transferring. So we trained in 5 and validated in the 6th one. So we had these in these sites, so you can see them here. And actually what it looked like, so we had here the planet data with the trained polygons, fed them in deep learning model. We had a lot of different let's say, models, architectures, tried them. We had different quantitative metrics, and in our output looks like that. So we have probability layers for each pixel. And this is in 3 meter resolution. And then from that, we can go to polygons, which, yeah, hopefully are good. In some regions that work. So some regions are similar to others, some not, and that is kind of a tricky part. So some areas didn't perform well. The variability between the sites is sometimes just too big. So deep learning models have the disadvantage that they need a lot of training data to perform well. But once they're well parameterized, have a lot of training data, they typically perform quite nicely. And at the moment, we're about to upscale that, so go far beyond these few sites. So here in this figure on the left, you see kind of where we have data now. We're currently updating that. So we download data for 22. We're still kind of a bit data limited, so we don't have an unlimited quota. And thanks to Mark Lara, who's also supporting me there with some data. So he's donating some data. Yeah, we don't have access to the full archive. If that can be, yeah, can happen in the future somewhere, I don't know, would be great. But yeah, what we see is we're kind of limited in training data and training areas. But there's this remote retrogressive Thorslumps action group. We're discussing semantics, but also or collecting data sets. We're doing experiments, how different people digitize Thorslumps to see, okay, if there are really, if the metrics that we automatically see as performance from model is that much worse than human performance. So that's pretty interesting. And a lot of people send me already their experiment outputs, and I already analyzed them. So, but I won't present them here yet. Maybe in a separate meeting there where we meet together with these people. Super interesting. And for now, we are kind of having an iterative model sampling approach. So we train with a certain amount of training data, create the output, or train the model, create an output globally, see where it works, where it doesn't work, and where it doesn't work, we add more training data. And at the moment we're at the 5th iteration. Training labels for the first 4 are available, so I share them on GitHub. The link is, I think, included later. And yeah, and for kind of real upscaling, of course, we need some more improved data ordering via the API, better data filtering, because the cloud masks, for example, from Planet are not good. And for operationalization, of course, scaling, distributed computing comes at some point into discussion or having that on HPC. And there, of course, data management, how to manage the data, especially if you have several thousands, millions of images, maybe. Okay, here's some examples. So one is from Banks Island here on the left, which works quite well. So we have training areas on Banks Island. So the model performs quite well in even these areas that the model hasn't seen before. So your points are the locations from the Lefkowitz and Way data set, 2019. So we can find them quite well and even find some other thaw slumps, which are some even Blue Nose Moraine. Canada is kind of similar from vegetation and structure, etc. So that works quite well there too. But where it doesn't work, this is one pretty bad example from Bykovsky Peninsula. So here's water. This is a very narrow peninsula here on the coast. That works quite okay. So there are thaw slumps, but of course in the water there are no thaw slumps. So there are some issues in some places with some landscape features. And here we also have an example where it doesn't work. So we have a lot of challenges with false positives. So too many thaw slumps or too many areas are identified as thaw slumps. So here in this kind of, around rivers where there's little vegetation. So also gravel bars are often bad. What are thaw slumps? Semantics is a problem. Spatial diversity. If we're using global or regional models, so regional models work typically better, but then scaling that to global is sometimes tricky. And of course, temporal dependency. At the moment, we look only at certain timestamps, but don't have kind of the temporal domain really included yet. But we're working on that, and Konrad is also, I think, looking in that. He's also here. He's developing a lot of the code for that. And thaw slumps are exactly that. They're extra tough on us. So they're a lot more challenging than lakes. And there are a lot of like data and code. So especially from that paper, you find that in my GitHub repo. Also interesting might be the training labels. Of course, transferring training labels can be also tricky from one data source to another. That's more details. And of course, the same thing that Chandi does, using your model, your pipeline, just map other objects, right? So water. So maybe that's also a thing to consider. Use deep learning for lake detection. And here we have surface water in the Lena Delta. Some might recognize it, especially Alex, I think. And pingos. So pingos also work. It's a cool, nice, fun little thing to map. Also, there are some public data sets, so we can do that as well. And with that, I thank you. This is a nice little regional lakes in northwestern Canada. As you might see, they're not as dynamic as Colima, so you might see that from the colors. So yellow means it's rather stable, less exciting than Colima, especially from change side. But summarizing that, so we did a lot of Arctic lake change data processing in the cloud with Earth Engine plus some HPC processing, automated environment. We have lake changes from 2000 to 2020. Need some fine tuning, and we have 30-meter base resolution. And the deep learning based RTS mapping is at the moment from 2018 to 2022. 2018 data availability is not as great. 3-meter resolution, varying accuracy, so it's tricky. We have the semantic challenges, which are still not solved yet. Standardizing approaches are very important, and there's a big ongoing community effort, which is super cool. I thank you, and it took quite long when I see here on the watch. So you contact me, drop me an email, check my GitHub. You can check my Twitter. I don't know if I'm moving over to Mastodon or whatever. I'm not sure yet. The Landsat Trend app is super cool. It's super addictive, very useful. And the PDG portal is also very important. And I really want to thank all the people involved, which would be too much, but special thanks to Mark really donating a lot of data. PDG team for setting that up, RTS and train team, and many, many more for supporting all the work. Thank you.
Big applause from all of us here. I will stop the recording, and then, you know, if hopefully Ingmar is
Yep.
around a little bit, if you want to have some questions and ask him some questions. I know we're over the hour, and yeah, super exciting stuff, Ingmar. Thank you.